at the University of Buenos Aires. Thank you very much. I want to thank the organizers for this beautiful invitation and the possibility to share this venue with Dr. Ross, who's part of our literature that we read, and also to have the team of neuroscience and this young audience, which is something that we welcome very much. As you can see in the title of my brief presentation, I thought it was interesting for me to talk about the collaborative turn in scientific investigations and research. So, especially in research of what is called the trans-scientific topics that can be formulated in academic venues, but transcend the core of the academia because they deal with the problems and issues of our times. This is a very difficult context characterized by many issues that are issues of concern, the predominance of finance logics, degradation of the environment, increase of poverty, migration. And so you probably saw how many times the Sustainable Development Goals where the main objective and the main goal is elimination of poverty for 2030. And you will see that Argentina and Brazil and many countries have ratified these goals, but they show how serious the situation is and how much we need to make progress with the knowledge needed to mitigate at least some of the issues and challenges that we're facing in an ever in a world that is getting more and more complex. So in that context, I talk about the collaborative turn, where we have scientific challenges that go hand in hand with democratic challenges. And we are in need of new research tools and we are trying to make knowledge more relevant and robust and actionable so that it can be translated into practice. And also, science is very much aware of the need to have legitimate procedures and how this has an impact on decision making and regulatory frameworks. So in our times, it is also very common to talk about a scientific world where what we need is to co-author or co-production of knowledge, to do a reframing of our problems, allowing for other perspectives from the scientific world and different analytic frameworks, establish a dialogue to come up with a new agenda. There's also a great need for change in scientific and operational institutions because there's, to some extent, a mismatch between the capabilities of science and the expectations and needs from the general public and decision makers. So in this new collaborative context, we face new cognitive and pragmatic obstacles which demand a different disposition and it requires for us to be more patient and more humble and to listen to other perspectives and criticism. You need to be able to, or to be willing to be redundant and repeat the concepts because maybe people don't understand the first time, and also be empathetic. The challenges of this type of knowledge production are manifold, and we have talked about in the interdisciplinary collaborations, and sometimes it requires to go beyond the world of academia and scientific institutions to enable dialogue with other social players. For example, representatives of governmental organizations and also civil society, like parents and other groups, for example, in schools or communities in the neighborhoods. And all of that means that we need to go back to rethinking about the framework and about the approach, and we need to be ready to review our own perspectives. So, in that context, I would say that the scientific voice shifts a little bit. Now, scientists are not just required to produce new knowledge that is published in a scientific journal, but something that I highlight in my slide and that I noticed in many of the texts that I read is that it's very important to be able to interpret and evaluate and summarize the information that we read in order to bring together all those perspectives that are claiming for a validation of the data and an integration of the data that has not taken place, especially if you take different sources and different disciplinary perspectives. Now, there's also a need and a demand for tailoring, because now the information needs to take into account the audience that is not the standard specialized audience. Because, for example, if you talk to a neuroscientist and a sociologist, they can talk to one another. But when you go to other audiences as your target, you need to do tailoring, and also you need to be able to come up with actionable points, taking into account the outcomes and the impact and the results. When we mention all of those experimental designs that had been put to work, we need to think on how to translate that knowledge into those experimental designs and be able to explore new ways in which to make collaboration possible. Social scientists are being invited more and more to be part of this dialogue and start building together with other parties. You cannot assume that someone comes from social sciences and then they know everything at work in a society. And in this, with this concept of co-production, we have several senses. One of them has to do with interdisciplinary approaches, not only for social sciences or natural sciences, but also other areas and disciplines. For example, IT, that end up with or come up with models, and mathematicians are also very important. So this is a very comprehensive effort to come up with interdisciplinary networks to work on projects. This is a big shift, and that can happen in academia and in science circles. But also, the idea of co production underlines a transformation that goes beyond that field because it transforms the identity of the different institutions and the way in which we approach the discourse, because we can hear the voice of the general public participating. Sometimes in societies you see audiences that were very much prepared to hear psychological explanations, but now they are demanding neurological based explanations. And the world of science is also waiting at some point to see what happens with regulatory frameworks. So, what are we supposed to do with this collaboration idea in science? I have been very lucky to participate in transdisciplinary groups that have a social science approach. And in these big teams, we see that sometimes dialogue is a desirable end, but not because it's desirable, it's less difficult or complex. And so there are efforts being made to monitor these efforts and see how we can move along. And also, we need the progress made in science for a wider reach that gets to the general public. Then we also have to think about what happens when we go from academia to the field, where you have other implications, other contexts, and other skills that are required from those that are doing these experimental interventions. And social scientists are very important. We need to collaborate so that we tell on exaggeration or inadequate constructions of the results of science. For example, saying that brain stimulation is going to transform schooling, we have to call upon those exaggerated promises. Sometimes there are ways to reduce the complexity in science, but that may lead to dystopias or utopias, and we tend to end up with a misconstruction of the results of science, saying that the world is going to be pure heaven or a total disaster. As social scientists, we need to play devil's advocate sometimes and make those short circuits visible. We need to put on the table the different approaches and the different scientific roles, thus contributing to expanding some of the concepts that scientists tend to forget, which is the social aspect. Sometimes the social scientist helps assume the diversity of perspectives on the table. And finally, the last point is the issue that has to do with language and the public understanding of the language of social sciences. It's important to use a language that does not preemptively vacuum the voice of the public as one member of this dialogue. If you start talking about the amygdala, we will close or we will obliterate the other side's perspective. there are many issues that have to do with synthesis of data and many points that deal or that have to do with this issue about how to deal with language. And this awareness and a humble position will help us understand how to talk to the other person, and it will help come up with new regulations showing that we are not applying something, but rather we are part of a new way of looking at ourselves and understanding who we are in society, understanding our neural system. And there's nothing to apply. There's a lot of room for action, and taking all of these points into account, we will do it better.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Cecilia. Professor Ribeiro is a researcher and a professor at the Brain Institute of at the Rio Grande University, and he's also the director of the Brazilian Association for the Progress of Science. Thank you very much. Thank you, Kathinka, Seva. Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to talk at C3, especially now that things get better. We look with high expectations from Brazil to Argentina. We want to follow the same path. I do not do neuroscience of poverty. I study people. I study octopus. I study, poverty, but not as my main topic, but as the context in which I work. I study, for example, how can we apply dreams to improve learning, and of course, this has more impact in low-class schools. I really liked it when Nick talked about social classes, because we have to go back to social classes, to that expression, because Marx was pretty popular and pretty effective. There's this idea that whatever is neuro is good. So if you show the image of a brain with colors, then you hit it. So basically, you can say nonsense and add an image of a brain, and people will basically believe it. At one point, this was applied to biotechnology, to nanotechnology. Neuroscience right now is in fashion, and there's a lot of junk, for example, in neuromarketing, which is nothing different from mass psychology in the previous decades. But now that I have expressed my disclaimer, I would like to share with you some ideas. I've been in touch with Seva and with his students, and we have discussed many, many topics throughout the years. So they know me already. The measurement problem. I don't like psychometric scales. I don't like IQ tests. Of course, there are many problems with that. I do agree with that. With you on that. I was telling one of the guests here that in the World Cup, in the 58th World Cup, we had the best. We had Garrincha, we had Pelé. Garrincha was almost as good as Pelé. And the captain says that he wants to run a psychological test of all players. And Garrincha is tested, an IQ test. And he starts doing the test. 5 minutes later, the psychologist leaves saying, I mean, this guy is an idiot. This guy is an idiot. And he wants to get the circle in the square space. I mean, this guy is completely stupid. This is a true story. And the captain replied, well, that's why he's on the team. He's at his best. How can you measure the capacity of a Garrincha using a method that is fit for the army, that is fit for the middle classes, that is fit for the, for the standard? I mean, poor people are smarter than the middle classes, than the wealthy, than the well-off. The middle class guy is looking at a situation of danger at the same time as the poor guy has already saved himself from that situation of danger. So how can you measure intelligence? You can measure intelligence in the context of a problem, how you solve that problem. Part is this weird science, Western, highly of high classes. There's science that's based on a bias, And this science is based on a bias. It's run and it's conceived by college kids for college kids. And if we run this pathway, we're going to start naturalizing poverty, saying, okay, they're good at stuff, like they're good at, I don't know, finding food in garbage cans. And that is terrible. We need to avoid this. We need to avoid this discourse in the hands of the neoliberals. And we need to be very generous, as we already said, with our disagreements. There's no one right position. There are different perspectives of the same problem. Since the world exists, there is inequality, and there is a growing inequality. It does not decrease, it increases. And it is worth noting that experience is not what happens to you, but what you do with that happens to you. People with very little stimuli is in complete despair. And there are people who suffer enormously and they survive. Another anecdote of a football player, Dada Maravilla. He was a great Brazilian player. And he didn't know his dad. His mom was schizophrenic. And his first souvenir is his mom throwing him in a garbage can so he would not turn into flames like her, because she burnt herself, basically. When he was interviewed, he would talk about that. And that was, that was a situation that would kill anyone. But the way he told about this experience was something that had happened to him that did not define him as a person, as a human being. And this goes back to what Nick was saying. Something very terrible happens to him, but he persists. He goes on. So we cannot stigmatize people. We cannot stigmatize people saying that, okay, he's poor, he has a certain brain size, he has a certain amygdala size. This is a reactionary attitude. At the same time, we cannot say, okay, these situations have no effect on you. No. We have to find the middle way. We need to understand that there are characteristics typical of this situation, of this condition of poverty, but we need to overcome poverty so people can choose whether they want to have certain capacities and capabilities or not. Not because they have to develop certain skills, because it's the only way of surviving. These are mere reflections. We need to find a middle way in a world of progresses, in a world that's progressist. We want to in a progressive way, in a progressive world. We don't want to increase inequality. We want to decrease inequality. And what we need to do as well is to take a look. I mean, not at the poor people. We know that we have to overcome poverty, but there's no way of overcoming poverty if we do not redistribute. Let's focus on wealth. How is the brain of a wealthy person? How is the wealth of a person who has $1,000 million? How is the brain? How is Trump's brain? How is Slim's brain? Now, when we look at SES, I mean, and we totally analyze this in brackets. But if we look for people who were born privileged, who never had to work, we are going to find very small sizes of very small brain sizes. We're going to find very, stagnated brains. Because I am positive that a brain that faces a no all the time suffers a lot. But how does a brain who's always been answered yes is? And this is the condition of wealthy people, people with all the money in the world. And because they have this money and they don't want to share this money, and that's the stem of all our problems. If the 5 wealthiest people in the world became Buddhas, became the most generous people in the world, and they really want to make a difference, things would be better. That is the only good news. Capitalism concentrated lots of wealth, and we can use that wealth, but these people have no idea what their historic responsibility is. So how does a wealthy man's brain work? When I had the chance to talk to very wealthy people, I noticed several things. They believe they're better. They have their own discourse. They believe that they are wealthy because they are smarter, because they work harder, because they work better. But basically, all adjectives depicting them are positive. They have no idea of the fact that their grandfather was a thief, was a pirate. They have no idea that they are stealing this money from other people, that they owe this money to society. Ideologically, it's very harmful for them to face reality. If they understood what their real position is, not their ideal, but their real position, I believe there would be room for change. I started discussing these ideas with a group of people in Rio who study moral decisions between wealthy and poor people, and we're studying a new project, an atomic resting space of very wealthy people. And we're trying to do a distal history of the family, the grandfather, the great-grandfather, and we want to find what's wrong with them, basically. But if we say so, they're not going to accept. We tell them that we want to study them and their families because they're so special. Definitely, they are special. It's not a lie, but they're not special in the way they believe they are. I believe that we are going to find very interesting stuff, like a very competitive great-grandfather, maybe a violent great-grandfather, maybe a person who's not very honest, but very, very smart. And we are going to see that each generation of these wealthy people has less space for spontaneity, for, solving problems. These people have no nose in their lives, and they lose total sense of empathy. In Rio de Janeiro, it's not so, but in Sao Paulo, only, I mean, if you're a wealthy person, you only see the people serving at your house, because Sao Paulo wealthy people use helicopters. They don't even use the car. In Rio, the situation is different. So studying, if we study rich people, I believe we can get the stem of the problem. There's no merit in this inequality. Maybe, I mean, the reason is that the wealthy are wealthy because they were not because they were smarter, but because maybe they were less honest, more brutal. If you go to M5, the the most recent psychiatric manual handbook, many people are skeptical about these M5, but let's take it as a reference. There are references, there are addiction references to many things like substances, sex, gambling. You can be you can be a TV addict, an internet addict, and generally it's seen as a disease. But there's no money addiction on it, and that's the worst of addictions. In almost all circles of society, one assumes that the more money you have, the better. Now, why are we sick? Where is there so much inequality? Why the rich people are so sick, and they are perceived not as sick people but as heroes? This discrepancy, this divergence of perspectives, there's a huge space for new policy. So we can grow awareness. Because what's the left historical problem? To kill the wealthy people, replace the wealthy people for other people who become, in their turn, rich. That is what happens in the French Revolution, in the Russian Revolution. That's what revolutions give. That's what happens. We have to see it from a different perspective. Instead of destroying the rich only to replace them, we need to understand them better. They need to understand themselves, and we need to understand them. I believe that is so much better than saying, oh, they're the enemy, they're bad people, they're evil. No, we have to see them as sick people, and many of them don't have a choice. They were born with the golden spoon in their mouths. Imagine what it is to be born in the Royal British family. It's a prison. There are many things you can't do, and there are many other things that belong to you just because you were born there, but you haven't worked for them. So there's a space of convergence, even with wealthy people, because in all these family, there are some, odd ones out that have some social responsibility, that have some member of the family who is questioning their situation. They don't want to perceive themselves as evil. So the big opportunity we have in front of us is to overcome this prehistoric, this Paleolithical instinct for hoarding, because if they become aware of this, maybe they can donate 99% of their assets. It will not change their lives. Many of them are reaching this conclusion. Many of them are finding the light in a way. Many people who are depressed, they are worried about their heritage. They have panic attacks. They cannot enjoy their lives, and you see that very often. There's lots of psychological suffering in the wealthy, because, but believe me, I don't believe that all this idea of wealthy people being happy It's not the reality for the very wealthy because they own power. And this debate is taking place in Brazil, in Peru, in Mexico. And I can see that there's a space to open this debate. And these people are looking for a purpose. They need a reason to live. They need a reason to justify what they are. I mean, with the exception of Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, I mean, it's true, they're donating 5-10% of their assets. It's an enormous, humongous amount of money, but it's 10% of their assets, not more. I mean, violent revolution, we know, is not going to solve anything. Why? Because there's no, there's no smarter group of people who are going to lead. This has not happened and will not happen. It's more of a Piketty sort of way. More taxes for the wealthier, and the possibility of having, the privilege of not having bodyguards, of not having to resort to helicopters. And what is the price for that? 45% of income in Sweden? I don't know. I'm just saying. I have no problem in studying the brain of the poor people. I mean, poverty has many deprivation conditions that are worthy of study. This is science. It's good. It's interesting. However, how much can we change the world thanks to that study, that research? Yes, there is some space for changing. I mean, for using this data to change the world, and we can use this data to apply new policies and inform new policies and change the situation. Nonetheless, I believe we should look the other way, like literally the other way. There's no poverty without wealth. At a point in time, everyone was poor, but it is not the case anymore. And in order to conclude, I mean, this is a very simple idea I'm exposing here. In the same way as we need a minimum to be wealthy, we also need a top, like a roof, like a maximum to be wealthy. You can be rich, but how rich can you become? There should be a limit. When I talked about this with very wealthy people, they take it personally. They get really angry. Why can't I be richer, wealthier? And this is a symptom of a disease. They want to get something. They want to accumulate stuff. They will not going to enjoy. You want a plane? You can have it. Great. You worked for it. You can have it. Now I want 2 planes. Why do you want 2 planes? You cannot be on 2 planes at the same time. So, 2 aircrafts? No. And this is an example, but it has to do with this idea of minimum and maximum. I mean, the minimum is never discussed. In many places in Europe, you can accept that there's a minimum of basic rights and basic material assets to live. Now, we need to discuss the maximum. How much money should be the limit? And when is the amygdala of rich people activate? Maybe we can ask that question here in South America.
¿Alguien quiere hablar?
Are there any questions? During the break, everybody said they wanted to ask a question. I need someone to please help me with the microphone, and we have to wake up from siesta.
Aldo, ¿lo conoces, Aldo?
Bueno, en primer lugar, muchísimas gracias por...
First of all, thank you so very much for this discussion. I think it's a big contribution from the new scientists and the intellectuals and academia to change. Criticism is a very important aspect, and unfortunately, it's not that frequent to see criticism at a university environment. My comments are very brief. First of all, I think that neurosciences make a unique contribution towards understanding phenomena such as hunger and deprivation by studying how the brain responds to those conditions. That is revolutionary within neuroscience, and that already justifies neuroscience as a field of study for research. It doesn't have to necessarily contribute directly to revolution. As a new knowledge, it can be part of a change rhetoric. Another aspect that I think is important is how to contribute from neuroscience to a discourse about social change. I'm basing myself on the fact that you are not going to ask neuroscience to action the revolution. It's not anthropology or psychology that are going to be a revolution. I think that is overdoing it, but they can contribute to they can use the prestige of neurosciences, but we need to prevent this knowledge from being used for antisocial discourse. Another aspect that is important, I have my notes to help remember what I wanted to say. Another thing that I wanted to say is that in neuroscience, not everything is extrapolation from animal experiments. Actually, neuroscience is about explaining causal paths in human brains, and also in social sciences, we study the changes in beliefs and the outcome of empathetic responses and the outcomes in social sciences on behavior. We are talking about direct studies on the human brain from psychological dimensions. I'm talking about cognitive neuroscience and social neuroscience. That's not only basic neuroscience based on animal experiments. So I think that this is part of of a scientific effort, and I think it's really interesting. But my conclusion is not that neuroscience is going to revolutionize education or hunger or distribution of wealth. And I don't like it when using the scientific discourse we displace other points that have to do with health. I think that people who do neuroscience are responsible for this because some other people use this discourse to benefit, to look for a position in a ministry, for example. There are no angels here either. So I think that this type of event where we start a debate aiming at analyzing the phenomenon where sociology and psychology have their place and where we have criticism with respect and a respectful discussion. I think those are interesting points and approach for in certain social sciences the way they are needed to change society. Any comments? Yes. over here, but wait for the microphone.
Gracias por las presentaciones.
Thank you for the presentations. We just had the discussion during lunch break. Let's see if he gives me the same answer here. You have a speech that is pro neuroscience, but taking into account the context. Neuroscience in the first world is not the same as in Latin America, let alone apply to poverty. To a certain extent, you're saying both things. You're attacking neuroscience, saying that you need to pay attention to the context of policemen going into a favela in Sao Paulo. And then on the other side, you're also saying we need to make more neuroscience of poverty, even if it takes scanning a rat. So, to what extent do we need to sustain each of those two paths? Do we need more research, even if it is out of context? And how is that compatible with our world? Well, it's like asking me, do you have to feed your child or give them a vaccine? Well, maybe both. They say, okay, let's take money out of university and use it for basic education. They don't do it, but even if they were sincere, that is something that is wrong, because taking money out from university to put it into primary school is a dichotomy that is not realistic. It is realistic if the government says there's no money, and then maybe you have to choose whether to do neuroscience experiments. But if we consider that there's money and there's time and there are people available, there's no reason why we shouldn't do everything. At a time when robots are taking jobs from everybody, that's another prediction from Marx, who said that dead jobs were going to grow and live jobs were going to decrease. There are no jobs that are guaranteed not to be taken over by robots in 20 years. So, do we need to continue working the way we are working, or maybe in 20 years we're going to have scientists and many other people out of jobs and they have no way of making ends meet? So, I think in the future, the world should look more like Sweden, where the difference between poor and wealthy is smaller. And I think also that neuroscience of poverty is basic science. It's not applied science. They want to be, it could be, but it's basic science. And as basic science, we need to do it, and we need to invest a lot of money on basic science. If we think it's already applied science and it's going to solve problems, I don't think anybody here sees it that way, not even Dr. Farah. So, as I said at the very beginning, I don't see a contradiction in those two terms in your question.
And to this and to the contribution of neuroscience to the social realities, I think we need to ask ourselves the question, what do we expect? What's the purpose of neuroscience in studying poverty? Is there a social purpose? Do we want to improve reality? Do we want to reduce poverty? Do we want to understand the causes of poverty? There are many different purposes. And if I may repeat, some of you may have been to the conference that Sebastián and I organized in 2015, where I presented the case of Sweden. Now, as you rightly pointed out, Sweden is probably the most successful welfare state still, even though we have also been touched by neoliberalism. It's still a welfare state. Now, this doesn't mean that people are very wealthy. It means that they don't have to be wealthy in order to live well, because through our income taxation system, which is proportionate to income, everything is paid for. Schooling, adequate housing, subvented food, medical aid, everything. So basically, poverty has been almost eradicated. Now, looking back in time, how did the Swedish government manage that? We did not presume that people would become good. We did not presume that people were good. To the contrary, the state presumed that people were probably not very good, and so they imposed laws. So the first thing to have that a democratic nation needs to do is to have a non-corrupt and non-politically corruptible legal system. And then you can impose laws for the distribution of wealth, for the abolition of poverty, etc., etc. It's not going to come from the good hearts of people, because good hearts are very rare to find. You shouldn't wait for it. Don't hold your breath or we will all suffocate. Now, the second thing, I would go back to the philosopher John Stuart Mill, and here we come to England, who said that the prime challenge for a society, once it has become advanced, is to maintain it. Because the next generation will have forgotten the fight. The next generation will be indifferent. It's comfortable. It's already comfortable. You were born into the benefits, so you don't understand how difficult it is to maintain them and how fast you can lose them. And so there are all these challenges. They are related to what one broadly could call human nature. That is, it has a tendency of being egoistic, rather self-serving, have a short memory, and be rather indifferent. And the further away the problems are, such as future generations, populations in other countries, other groups of ethnic belonging, the more easy it is to be indifferent. I think that in order to improve social realities, you really need to not assume that there is going to be goodwill in the country, because there is not. You really need to assume that you have to have in place a legal system that imposes a distribution that society finds adequate. Now, Nick told us that there were millions of poor children in the UK. Now, there is no reason for that, because the UK is a rich country, very rich. And so this is simply the fifth biggest economy in the world. So this is simply a sign of bad will. And the indifference. We don't always need to speak about Latin American indifference. You can also speak about the European indifference with respect to other countries. And Sweden is one of the worst. We are proud to have a welfare state. We are very proud of having abolished poverty. And we'll speak endlessly about it to those who care to listen. However, if you read the Swedish press describing those presidents in South America who have successfully raised their populations above the threshold of poverty, Correa in Ecuador, Morales in Bolivia, suddenly they're called populists. And suddenly that becomes something anti-democratic. Lo and behold, so welfare is reserved for the Swedes. There is something profoundly racist going on here. And again, we are now referring to a sort of vague human nature debate. So, message repeated. We can't hold our breath for any goodwill because it's not going to be there. We simply have to have a very tough system to impose and to maintain those structures that we want to have maintained. What neuroscience can contribute, perhaps, is an analysis not necessarily of the mega-rich, but of all of us. All of us, the so-called good people included. Why are we so selective in our sympathy? Because we all are. Even the best, the kindest, the nicest person is still going to be selective. It's something that is entrenched in us. I think neuroscience can have interesting contribution in studying just the ordinary citizen in normal conditions. Thank you.
No, que para pasar el micrófono. Well, I can do one question, if you want. Do you have any recommendation for, because we have a problem here, probably in all the world, and politics like asignación universal por hijo, or something like this, cash transfer programs are rejected by media class population. They say, why you are giving money to the poor and so on. Do you have any recommendations to work on that acceptations for medium and high social class? Because if not, it's very difficult to implement that politics. Thank you.
Okay, so this discussion has gone in a direction which I wasn't expecting. So let's say if we have to talk on the one hand how we're going to achieve radical social and political transformations, and does neuroscience have a part to play in that? And on the other hand, at the more modest level, what kinds of policies might we implement in the short and medium term that would have radical consequences for the levels of inequality in society? Now, I don't want to talk about the radical transformation of society, because I think that's an issue which perhaps deserves a discussion all on its own. And about how you mobilize people and how you transform societies, and about the problems with populism and its authoritarian and its egalitarian forms. This is a whole different kind of debate. So let me just focus on two questions. First question, what should neuroscience do in a situation in the real world where we see massive social, political, economic inequalities? What might be the role that neuroscience has to play here? And I think this relates to what is the question that neuroscience ought to ask. So our colleagues here who've been working on the neuroscience of poverty ask the question, how does poverty damage the brains of individuals, and therefore, in a sense, what is an unequal society culpable for? What should it be blamed for? It should be blamed for the damage it inflicts upon the poor. And I have a lot of sympathy, actually, with saying it should be blamed for the damage it inflicts upon the poor. And our colleague over here mentioned Marx and Engels. Well, if you read Marx or if you read Engels, the conditions of the working class in Britain, you see what an unequal economic system inflicts upon the lives of the poor. Their lives are shorter, their lives are sicker, their bodies are stunted, etc., 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 etc. I have a lot of time for neuroscientists and other scientists documenting the bad effects of levels of inequality that we have. I think there is a place for that, and nothing that I would say that there's not a place for that. I think you have to be careful how you pose the question, however, and you have to be able to pose the question in terms, I'm sorry to say it again, in terms not of the proximate, not how a mother treats her child, but in terms of the distal, what places the mother in that situation when her choices about what food she can use, what housing she can live in, what resources she can bring to her kids are radically impoverished by the world she lives in. So that's a question of one set of questions. Second question, what might be the question that neuroscience might ask? I think the question that neuroscience might ask is slightly different. It is, what enables people in conditions of such abject, humiliating poverty to survive, to thrive, and often to contest the world in which they live? And that requires us to understand how people live, and actually see people in their natural settings as much more active, as striving to survive, often against the worst possible odds, often using very, very limited resources. Now, what are the things that enable human beings to have the energies and the capacities to be able to survive? The word resilience has a very bad name here. I gave a talk a while ago in Bogota, and I kept, instead of saying resilience, because I was trying to argue for the importance of resilience, I was tired, I was jet-lagged. Every time I said resilience, people booed. Every time I made the mistake and said resistance, people applauded. But I don't think it's just resistance. I think if you try and understand what makes people in very difficult circumstances bond together to enable themselves to make a different life for themselves, neuroscience has a part to play. It's not an individual character trait. It's to do with the social bonds between individuals. It's to do with the trust relations that you have with others. It's to do with the resources that you can draw upon in your community. Everything we know about resilience shows that resilience is an incredibly collective experience, and it grows out of relations between one another. This is why in another part of my work, when I work in the area of mental health and psychiatry, I have worked so much with the user and survivor movement, with seeing collective movements growing out of the experience of being a subject of a psychiatric system, often alienating and individualizing people. When people begin to work together, they can produce radically new knowledge and conditions for change. So I'd like to see more on the collective neuroscience of resilience, the social neuroscience of resilience. In terms of your question, I think that one can show in all sorts of ways that even in narrow economic terms, things like conditional, like cash transfers and those kind of basic, universal basic income and so on, even in narrow cost-benefit economic terms, over a 20 or 30-year time, deliver calculable economic benefits. As I said, my colleagues, Mauricio Avendano and his group, have done a lot of work which looks at the way in which better financial provision for parents, non-conditional welfare systems, freedom transport passes, all more money for kids in poor schools, all these things 10, 15, 20 years down the line generate economic benefits that can be calculated in very traditional sorts of forms. So I think at one level, to support those kinds of arguments, you need actually not revolutionary arguments, but really very narrow cost-benefit economic arguments to say, look guys, if you have a perspective that's more than 3 years, if you have a perspective of 5, 10, 15 and 20 years, then the investment that you make now will pay off when these people now are in the 60s and 70s, and less of them are suffering from dementia, less of them are burdens on the state, blah, 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 blah. So I do think you can make those arguments. Whether neuroscience has anything to do with that, I don't know, but neuroscientists are citizens, so they should get out there and argue for it. In general, I think that my argument has been that psychiatrists, neuroscientists and so on should get out in the public realm and argue for the changes in public policy that are going to make the real transformations, not argue for more research on individual poverty consequences. That I'd like to see them as public intellectuals making public statements about the social and political conditions that bring so many of our fellow citizens into misery and keep them there.
Can I just briefly reply to that question as well? I agree with what you said, Nick. I would just like to add a slight pessimism, because I totally agree with the argument that this would be a very sound socioeconomic policy, and that investment in that type of unconditional help has been proven very, very efficient, like preventive healthcare and many other things. However, the problem, or one of the problems, is that in many countries, members of the wealthier groups, they positively do not want to have a division of wealth at all. They do not want to have further competition in their schools where their children go. They don't want to have racial mixing. This is an ideology which is not based on economic rationality. It's an ideology that is based on social class thinking, ethnicity, racism, etc., etc., etc. It's as old as human beings. We have it in every part of the world. So I think there is a multitude of questions. And that was partly the point I was raising with respect to what you said, Siddhartha, that really we need to understand why human beings are so sectarian and so racist and so short-sightedly, self-servingly deceitful. I mean, it's a pretty horrible biped. and I think that some scientific analysis of what can we do with this brain in spite of it, because things are not looking good, right? I think most of us can agree with that, even in Sweden.
Of course, even in Sweden, the wonderful Swedish welfare state was built on eugenics up until 1995.
Okay, can functions.
It's welfare for our people in our people's home, and not for all those others who want to come and steal.
Ok, viene una pregunta que ya está desde el bloque de la mañana que
We have a question that is here from the morning slot. Neuroscience is always related to right-wing ideologies in all countries. Is that so? Please start. No. No. We are at a moment in history. In the 200 BC, people knew that the earth was round. People forgot about that, and Magallanes had to go around the world to prove it again. And there are many people today that believe that the earth is not round. If we need to defend something, it is science, definitely. Even if it is at the service of the capital, of the dominating power, it is always at the service of liberation, of freedom. It is the same science that said that marijuana would burn neurons. It's the same science that says today that marijuana promotes synaptogenesis and neurogenesis. For many reasons, science is libertarian. It's our best solution. It's our best possibility. If you talk to scientists from everywhere in the world, they tend to be progressive people. They want social progress, and they're politically progressive. But the devil hides in the details. There are many people who believe they are progressive, but they're at the service of capital. Of neoliberalism. If you are going to demonize science, then you are on the wrong path. Today in Latin America and in Africa, there's this neo-Pentecostal evangelism, which is misogynist, racist, anti-life, and it's developing and unfolding with strength. I believe that we should not take that path. We need to fight to place science where it should be, on the side of people, on the side of equality. But to say that science is a social construct, no. That's definitely not the way to go. Or these violent people who hold power in Brazil and in Bolivia, they hold the Bible in their hands. But these people, they are not even believers. They are not even Christians. They say they're Christians. They call themselves Christian, but they don't practice Christianity. They're pre-Moses, because Moses said you won't kill. You shall not kill. If we want progress and future, it is holding hands with science. It's been millions of years that our ancestors were chosen because they would protect the people from their tribe. They would kill the people from outside their tribe, and they would hoard and accumulate wealth. We have to just kill that pattern. This is what we have to fight against. But science, quitting science would be suicidal, because it is what enabled us to have enough abundance to talk about the eradication of inequality, because 500 years ago, even 500 years ago, it was not that way. Imagine Napoleon saying, I want to feed the world. He would have not been able to. It was totally impossible. Today, we have enough to feed the world. But we need to solve our hardware problem, because we humans tend to protect what's inside and kill what's outside. When oxytocin was discovered, it was called the love hormone. No, but it's not that way. It does not have to do with a rat caressing and kissing her family. But it's, the fact of, killing other people also secretes oxytocin. So we need to kill this pattern. And then the new research agenda for the future, with all these perspectives, the models, the people from formal sciences, from hard sciences, people from natural sciences who see it from a biological perspective, and the social scientists trying to identify the difficulty. What happens with the Human Brain Project? How does this interdiscipline or transdiscipline work?
It's many of the positive and negative aspects that we have been addressing here today. Scientifically, the transdisciplinary work functions very well in the Human Brain Project. And for those who don't know, the Human Brain Project is a European project that runs for 10 years with a €1 billion budget, approximately. Nick has been leading the social science work in the HPP. I have been leading the philosophy research in the HPP, and I'm also one of the directors of the whole project. So I know it pretty well. The cross-disciplinary research has been very successful and very interesting, and we have found ways to advance knowledge in many positive senses. However, what is lagging behind, in my view, and I do think that Nick would agree with me here, is the social responsibility in application, the social awareness, the awareness of how this, after all, this is a publicly funded project. We're talking about public money. So it should really come back to the public, and it does to some extent. But there is a sort of intrinsic fraying present in that sense. So it's almost something we need to impose and say, you really have to, it's payback time, guys. We have received this money, now we have to pay back. And I am more positive now than I was a couple of years ago, but that is also because we have really been arguing very strongly for this. Also some of the scientists that are key in the project. But very often there is this lack of engagement in the social application, the social use. And I really agree with Sidarta, and I think all of us would agree, that we need to defend science. But science needs to be an enlightenment project, as it was in the 18th century. We have science to thank for a lot. But scientists need to be socially engaged, and they are not always. They live in comfortable, little secluded realities, and they allow themselves themselves to withdraw into their secluded realities. I think that is unacceptable. We have a social responsibility, we need to take it, whether or not we're publicly funded. And Human Brain Project does take some steps on the way, but so far as I'm concerned, I think we should take more. Now, Nick, you can...
So I agree with Kathinka that there's been a lot of interdisciplinary work amongst the different branches of neuroscience and the computer sciences and robotics, because I think we've often made the mistake here and elsewhere of saying the word neuroscience as if there's one neuroscience. And there are not. There are many, many, many different theories, many different styles of thought, very many different modes of working, very many different questions within the neurosciences. And then there are the areas where the neurosciences merge into computing and robotics and all sorts of other areas. Some of it works at the molecular level, some of it works at the more molar level, etc., etc., etc. I don't know quite how many labs there are in the Human Brain Project, 150 or so different labs, probably a few thousand researchers. I don't know how many social scientists, sociologists there are. I suspect three. I suspect three sociologists amongst these hundreds of labs and thousands of researchers. Now, why is that important? It's important because I've tried to suggest to my colleagues that actually it's scientifically accurate to recognize that the human brain exists in a human body, and the human body exists in a human environment, and the human brain has been evolved over millennia in order to manage relations amongst other humans in a social and material environment. And if you strip the body away from the brain, and if you believe that you can understand the functioning of the brain outside those relationships with its environment, then I believe you will have a very impoverished understanding of how the human brain, or indeed any other brain, works. Now, social scientists have been embraced into the Human Brain Project, but largely because we are thought to be the guys who deal with social responsibility, who make sure that we're taking our message to the community. We're involved in public engagement. We're involved in responsible research and innovation, and all those things which surround the scientific core of the project. Kathinka has been very, very successful in making sure that some basic philosophical questions are raised and understood, say, around consciousness in the work of the neuroscientists themselves. But it has, I have to say, been more difficult to get our dear colleagues to understand the very basic scientific fact that the human brain is simply unintelligible outside its physical, social, and material environment, because after all, that's what it was built for. We have heard for probably 50 years that we need to first understand the brain at the molecular level, and then we can gradually move up, scale up, as they say, scale up from molecules to circuits, from circuits to organs, to organs, to organisms, etc., etc., etc. But that scaling up, it seems to me, has been very, very unsuccessful. And perhaps we ought to think about the necessity of always understanding the brain in its environment. So that, for me, has been a frustration. We've tried to do exactly that kind of transdisciplinary, trans-scientific project. It, in practice, is, and I've tried to do it in many, many different ways, in practice it is hugely, hugely difficult to get dialogue between these very different styles of thought. And to get that dialogue to be more than a grudging acceptance, but a realization that you actually have to pose the questions differently, undertake the research differently, interpret the results differently, if you're really going to do that transdisciplinary research. I remain mildly optimistic, but only mildly. But I should say that thanks to Kathinka, the Human Brain Project is a lot more transdisciplinary now than it was 8 years ago or 12 years ago when I first got involved in it. So we've gone some way down that long path.
Virginia. ¿Quién tiene el micrófono? Yo. Gracias.
Hola. Bueno, ya paso.
Hello. There are so many topics to tackle, but from the morning, I get back something. We are always apologizing for working in neuroscience because there's so much prejudice in neuroscience, not neurology, not other disciplines, but neuroscience, at least in our context, is not the most popular kid on the block. It is highly linked with a rightist political ideology, and we have to deal with this. This is the first thing I wanted to say concerning what happened today in the morning. People were saying, well, we do neuroscience, we work on neuroscience, we're neither leftist nor rightist, we are progressive. I work on language. I work at a university, at the School of Philosophy, and whoever works on a neuro project is object of prejudice. But related to this, we set up the thresholds very high. The goals are almost unreachable. Let me use an example. When a discourse analyst analyzes a discourse and shows how ideas are being manipulated, we're not asking for a revolution. We're not asking him or her to kill the person who's manipulating the discourse. The mere fact of showing that there has been manipulation is enough. The objective has been fulfilled, and there's social value in it. If, as neuroscientists, if we can show the damages, the brain damage, which is caused by poverty, by lack of access to education, and if we can show this, and we can show the consequences on development, and if we can show that there can be effective interventions so as to avoid this fate, I don't think we need, I don't think neuroscience should lead the revolution. This is our small revolution, if you want. If we do this seriously, professionally, if we show it to society, then we're fulfilling our objective. Then our revolution is done. And last, I believe I want to highlight that if there's something good about neuroscience, is that it is interdisciplinary in its ethos. We have psychologists, doctors, anthropologists, philosophers. We are people who come from different walks of life, and we converge here. And we do this in a professional way with clear objectives, and I believe that that is and I believe that that is we should do. No more, no less. I would like to make a comment.
Está clarísimo.
I understand what you're saying about being defensive, but science is not neutral. It's a human construction in a specific historical context, and our social responsibility as researchers is to understand what niche you're putting that knowledge into. The other problem is that knowledge per se cannot be separated from the historical context where it is generated. And I think social sciences can help a lot in co-building this. For us, it's sometimes difficult to co-design experiments with other disciplines, but that would be fantastic because we need to work on the methods that can help us transcend the individual level. Neuroscience is a basic science built on individual cases. So going to the population level, as Nick was suggesting, would be another step that is just emerging in basic science and neuroscience in the last 5 or 6 years. So the historical context is very important. The link to other disciplines is very important. And it should show us that an experiment cannot become public policy on its own, even if it was good. I was discussing with Kathinka 2 or 3 things that I'm always concerned about. We don't receive training at university on ethics and policies. And almost all of us work with people, but we don't have any training on regarding what a policy means and what impact it has. And in politics, there's a methodological discussion, as in linguistics, with tensions that have to do with the historical moment, and many areas are involved in decision making. So I think we should not devote time to justifying what we do, but we have to be humble and get our knowledge to stand on its own, because sometimes these things are used by our critics. We need to be humble and learn along the lines of what Cecilia was saying. We need to be more clear about what to build and who to collaborate with in experiments with plutocrats, as Sidarta was suggesting. Sidarta talked about this last year in Punta del Este, and many people laughed about him or at him. And as an experiment, it sounds a little bit bizarre to say that you're going to study wealthy people's brains. But to some extent, I agree that our work has value. I don't need to justify my science, but I do question myself whenever I don't have a clear idea about the social positioning of my products and the following designs. I am not a behavioral scientist, but the experiments have a behavioral basis. So we are studying things by reproducing them in experiments that don't go so well. I don't know if this happens in many disciplines. I don't know if Juan Carlos wants to talk about this point, especially from the point of view of other provinces where we have tensions with other disciplines and also contradictions. And in that, we are playing the part of how we dialogue with other disciplines. And one thing is to be in the UK or Sweden, and another thing is Rio or Natal or other cities in Brazil, and the provinces of Argentina are also different. So it's as if the floor is moving underneath our feet all the time. Just one comment. I want to clarify that I'm not saying that we need to be aseptic towards society. I'm not saying that science should be or should separate itself from society. I don't know if I suggested that, but thank you for that clarification. Andrea? I have two questions that are connected to one another. One was mentioned at different points. Sidarta made this point explicit, and it is the fact that we are a little bit far from having science or neuroscience about vulnerability that is applied science. And my question is, how do you imagine that applied neuroscience without all the limitations that we mentioned today? And in connection with that, and with what Kathinka said about governments that lower inequality in our region, they are called populists. And our science in Argentina and in Brazil, in Latin America, is measured by CONICET, for example, by publications and papers we publish, but these publications are not the same when they come from the US or Europe as our publications. So we are being evaluated according to what more equalitarian countries say about us, and we are considered inferior to some extent.
Okay, I'm one question behind, apologies. I just wanted to say something to Sebastián about the lack of training in ethics and social and political issues. Go back 50 years and medical students would have no training in medical ethics. Now it's obligatory for every medical student. King's College London, where I work, probably trains more graduate neuroscientists than anywhere else in Europe. They have absolutely no training, no session whatsoever in ethical and social issues. Correction, they have one session which is taught by me. One session. I asked the person who runs the master's program, and he said, well, our students are in lectures from 9 o'clock in the morning till 5 o'clock in the afternoon, 4 days a week, and I'm sorry we've got no time at all to talk about these ethical issues. So I think that's scandalous. I really do think it's scandalous. And it's not as if people are not interested in these issues. So to give an example from a slightly different area of neuroscience, something we've worked on in the Human Brain Project, which is the potential of neuroscientific research for misuse, for military, political, and security uses. So we in our group, including Kathinka, started doing a bit of work on this. Could you, neuroscientists who are doing this work in the Human Brain Project, begin to think about the possible implications that your work might have for military security, etc., uses? And the first response that we got was, oh, that's a ridiculous question. We're doing very basic neuroscience here, and it's got no consequences whatsoever. 3 years down the line, after long discussions, after taking those arguments seriously, after giving many different examples, there is now a group which I chair, which I was just chairing last week, where we've got these very basic neuroscientists talking absolutely in very intelligent ways about how some of their work might have these consequences. The example that we've focused on quite a lot is face recognition. So face recognition will help you open your smartphone here, but it will also, in China, help you try and identify persons who might be risky to the state. These very fast face recognition systems which use algorithms to compare a face to a database of faces. Now, when you begin to work with the neuroscientists, to think about the examples, to talk them through seriously, of course they're interested in these questions, and of course they have a huge amount to comment on these questions. So if people who work on basic neuroscience and are somewhat naive sometimes about these issues, it's kind of not their fault. It's because nobody has thought that this should be an essential part of the training of neuroscientists. In the same way, in my view, that some basic neuroscience ought to be part of the training of social scientists who make all sorts of assumptions about what human beings are like without ever having attended any kind of lectures or looking at any scientific evidence about the kinds of creatures that human beings are. So I think there's lots to be done here, and it would extend from these questions of military uses through to these other questions of what are and have been historically the implications of the kind of work that we've been talking about now.
Voy a intentar contestar, aunque sea una parte de la pregunta.
I'm going to try and answer Andrea's question, last question. I'm going to answer last question. I don't imagine poverty neuroscience applied, really. It's still basic science, and we are still trying to understand many of the things that I mentioned in the morning in my introduction. And we need to add to that list the need to socially contextualize that knowledge and go beyond the microsystem to the distal connections. But we are still answering very basic questions. Of course, basic knowledge makes sense because it gives us information about complex issues from a different perspective. But how does that become applied science? I think that transcends the study of neuroscience. It has to do with co-building with other disciplines. I am optimistic because I think that if labs can incorporate different disciplines and there's a multi-discipline approach to this, is fine. I liked Sidarta's idea very much, but I think I have to move to Brazil to do that. I don't think I'm going to be allowed to do that in Argentina. Anyway, there's also we had a project at some point to go to middle class homes, but they wouldn't answer the door. They wouldn't open the door for us. And there's also a lack of empathy to some extent when we try to do these collaborations, but maybe barriers to collaboration have to do with fear or ideas that do not work when you study poverty, because maybe in hospitals they have different expectations. But I'm imagining something that is a co-construction in the future. And also in connection with your question, I think we need to come up with a better answer to how to distribute the money. For example, when we apply for a grant, there are strategic topics, and one of the strategies is to apply for a grant in my discipline and in strategic topics because I have more chances. But what's the criteria and who evaluates how to assign grants? I have no idea, or I don't have a clear idea about how that is done. So we need to discuss it. And regarding publication of papers, it's not the same for all disciplines. We should not assume that your peers are going to give you more points because you publish in a publication in the US or Europe. Because in social science, that's different. And again, we need to open a debate about what to evaluate when we evaluate a paper. I don't know how it works in the UK and Sweden, so I would like to hear Nick and Kathinka's answer to this. But the issue is that inequality systems are replicated when it comes to allocate funds. So if you have a project that is interdisciplinary, you don't know if it's going to be assessed in the right way. There are little opportunities. It would be great to have Diego Hurtado here because he would be able to talk about the structural barriers inside the disciplines so as to transcend them and be able to be working on interdisciplinary frameworks. So I don't imagine something that is or that applies within the disciplines but is at the same time interdisciplinary. I don't know. Are there any more questions before we close? Does anybody want to confess something? You want to confess something, Aldo? Something that you can confess here. Okay, well, Mariana, one more. Well, there's an idea that I have thinking about the purposes of this meeting regarding the political uses of evidence and some of the interventions. For example, Marta Fara's intervention, she talked about misuse and misunderstanding. Sidarta also mentioned the fact that people see an image of a brain with colors and they believe it. Sometimes science puts the public in the hot spot as if they were guilty. But we need to see how we incorporate citizens' demands in production of knowledge. I wanted to hear your opinion about this.
¿Podés explicarlo de vuelta?
Could you explain it again in Spanish? It was kind of convoluted. Well, when it comes to social sciences, we talk about the deficit model that scientists have in connection with the general public. That is to say, segregate between expert public and general public. And if you think about political uses, you need to transcend this segregation and think about a science with citizen ideas. Okay, from my perspective, we have to get out of a vertical model where knowledge is at one spot and go to a distributive model where knowledge is everywhere, in the public, in different social players, in the media, and in decision makers, about what's the problem that needs to be analyzed. Up to now, we are deciding what the problems are to be analyzed. Now that I understood the question, I think it's a very important question, but we don't have an answer for that. Because on the one hand, we agree that segregation between layman and specialist is something that is not democratic, actually. And a month ago, I was here in an event with 50,000 people, and it was clear that in connection with cannabis medicine, everything is very horizontal. The mothers of children with diseases are teaching doctors how to do things because they have a pragmatic everyday knowledge that many doctors don't have. So that's very good, but on the other hand, the gap between the specialists who know something and those who know nothing is widening. In Brazil, for example, people don't read so much as in Argentina. So someone ends high school and they forget everything they learned. So if you start talking to someone on the street and I talk about genes, I need to explain what a gene is, what a protein is, what an enzyme is, because people don't grasp those concepts. So what is happening is that now we all have access to knowledge easily. We can Google something, and in 30 minutes I can learn about something that I didn't know. But really knowing about something is becoming more and more difficult because there's more knowledge to acquire. So what is happening is that we are all becoming laymen. The distance between laymen and specialists is widening. And this is going to generate problems. Someone says, okay, physics say there was a Big Bang, but before the Big Bang there was nothing because there was no space and no time. It makes a lot of sense for physicists, but it doesn't make a lot of sense for anybody else. And so if you ask, what happened before the Big Bang? No, that's a bad question. Next question. Now, if we talk about economy, the finance minister in Brazil says that economic science, liberal economic science tells me I should let the capital do its work. There's science and there's numbers and there's formulas, but for me to be able to address that in his terms, I need to have a lot of knowledge to tell that he's not telling the truth. So it's very difficult, and it's becoming more difficult for a layman to be able to have a discussion with an expert because they don't have the tools. And the opposite is also true. There was a spill of oil in the coast of Brazil. They say it's very contaminated, but the solid waste has disappeared. They don't see hydrocarbonates, and so they don't believe that's a pollutant. So science is moving far away from us. You may be a specialist in one point, but you cannot be a specialist in many points. So we need to believe more and more in authoritative arguments, but that's a little bit conflicting with democracy. I think that's the 21st century Babel Tower. A lot of confusion is being generated to the point that people think that everything is a question of opinion. In the United States, this is very clear, and in Brazil, it's very clear, and I think it's also happening in Europe. People want to believe in what they want to believe, and they say everything is relative. This is what Mr. Trump does and what Bolsonaro does all the time. I don't believe in science. Or people say, I don't believe those fires that they show on TV burning down Amazonia. And it seems as if the strongest opinion or the loudest opinion is the truth. And science is not stopping. it continues to generate more and more information that may be good for nothing. So that's the discussion too. What's the question? What are we researching? What is it that we're trying to do with this research? Are we trying to help people? Are you researching this because you're getting paid? So
could I just respectfully disagree with our last speaker? In the research centre that we have on society and mental health, all the research that we have involves service users, that is to say, people who've had experience of mental health and been treated by mental health services. We do work on mental health in children and adolescents. We have a group of kids, school kids, who help and advise us on this research. They talk about their own lived experience of being a child today, what it means for them, what they think are the most important issues to research. They help us identify the questions. They help us interpret the results. If there are things they don't understand, we take the time to explain them to them. We discover, if you take a week or 2 weeks or a month with people, many people, most people, even kids, can begin to understand the science, at least enough to make very positive contributions to it. I've been in too many meetings where the public is thought of as ignorant. I remember going to a meeting. I used to work with the British Royal Society. The head of the British Royal Society, a Nobel Prize winner called Paul Nurse. First meeting I was at with him on this social responsibility panel, Paul Nurse said, there's no point in talking about genes to the lay public. They don't think tomatoes have any genes in them whatsoever. Well, maybe they do or maybe they don't. But if you bother to take half a day to explain genetics to people, they can pretty much understand the basics of it. So I think we can blame the public for being ignorant, for being distant. But we can, in our everyday practices, in a very small way, not denying what you're saying about Bolsonaro and all those people, in a very, very small way, we can begin to bring people in, to listen to them, to help understand what their questions are. And often in the areas where I work, the areas of mental health, of poor mental health of kids, of poor mental health of people in adverse circumstances, them explaining what it is for them in terms of their experience that they find helpful or unhelpful, them explaining what it is to live a life like that can actually be transformative in the kind of research that we do. So I think we should try a little bit more myself.
So you? Bueno. Okay. Right. It's not easy to close such a diversified discussion, so I will start with the easiest part, and that's to say again, as a co-organizer, that I'm so pleased for all of you to have come here and given these interesting presentations, and also thank the audience for the lively and interesting discussions that we have had. I hope you have enjoyed it at least half as much as I have. I've enjoyed it immensely, and I'm pleased for this day. Now, something strikes me as being one of the key not results, but key aspects of what we have been discussing, and that is engagement. Now, when I started working in more socially oriented philosophy and science research, there was some discussion about the ivory tower of science, that scientists were operating in an ivory tower secluded from social realities. And then came social science, philosophy, moral philosophy, and ethics, and changed this, making it obligatory for scientists to relate their scientific research to social realities and applications. Not necessarily if you were analyzing the theorem of Gödel, but certainly if you were discussing something as concrete and tangible as the neuroscience of poverty. However, there is another risk that I briefly addressed, and that is when academics become a bit comfortable in their own world, in their own realities, and they sort of withdraw in a new ivory tower, an ivory tower which includes maybe courses in ethics and social realities and social responsibility and application, because these may be necessary conditions, but they are certainly not sufficient conditions for a well-off academic to actually reach into the social realities. And what was really important for me today when we were discussing the planning of this conference is that it had to be relevant for people who are actually working with the adverse conditions in reality. I mean, it has to be tangibly relevant. And in order for that, I think we need to come back to the level of engagement, which is not always so comfortable. In Sweden, as I've been mentioning, there is a very strong tendency to not really care about what happens in other countries, what happens in distant social contexts, or what would happen in the future, because life is so comfortable. And I think this is a challenge which we face today as academics. Everyone faces it, but now this happens to be an academic context, so I mentioned that as an academic challenge. We need to reconnect science to an enlightenment project. We need to become far more engaged in social realities, in political realities, not least in the context of fake news. I mean, the reason why we have horror examples of politicians like Bolsonaro, Trump and others is because of fake news. But we also have fake scientific news. And if we don't beware, if we don't become active in preventing this, then we will be culprits by virtue of having been indifferent. So just by being neutral, which is an impossible stance to have, we will be co-culprits in creating false scientific news that will then aid misuse of science in political applications. And I would like to end this point by quoting Dante Alighieri, because he said that the worst people are not the really bad, evil people. These people have an identity, and they deserve going to hell. But there is an even worse group. They are the indifferent, neutral people who try to pretend to be nice, but of course they are not. Because you can't be nice if you don't take a stance. If you're indifferent in the face of evil, then you're the worst, according to Dante. You don't even merit going to hell. These people are being faceless. Their faces are taken away from them, and their names. And they end up in a limbo, identityless forever. So I think that there is a risk, through the comfort that we as academics live in, to become disengaged and speak beautifully about beautiful ideals, but it remains only words. So somehow, somewhere, we need to get more active and get back into the basics of social realities, especially in this area that we have been discussing here today. But the discussion makes me quite hopeful that this might well be happening right now, as I always get more hopeful when I get the input from the younger generations. So I thank you for that.